Well, Kamal, a big day for bricklayers because Labour wants us to build, and then build a little bit more. So they've unveiled the biggest changes to, and crucially, liberalisation of the planning laws in a generation to help deliver on the party's promise of 1.5 million new homes this Parliament. It's a lofty aim. It is a lofty aim. And I think it's going to be met with some opposition because the proposal is to give councils new mandatory targets for house building, and they will be the ones to review green belt boundaries to identify the so-called grey belt. So we had brownfield, we had green belt, now we've got grey belt.
Running out of colours. It sounds like a karate competition.
Doesn't it? It's grey belt just where a load of boomers live. This is harsh, isn't it?
And they've also solved, of course, many of our Christmas challenges with presents because we can now buy each other the National Planning Policy Framework document.
Who needs sleeping pills?
Which is what's come out today. I always worry, Camilla, governments seem to imagine that announcing a policy framework is the policy delivered. And those two things are obviously miles apart. The Conservatives have said that the big danger with such a high target for new builds on housing is that they're going to build all over the green belt, particularly around our big cities, particularly London, where pressure on housing is at its most acute, and across the southeast. Where, though, Camilla, in all this, I thought that the key cabinet member for housing was Angela Rayner.
Yes.
But Angela Rayner, oddly, she did do the media round at the weekend.
Yeah, but that didn't go very well, did it? Should we just have a listen to how she handled a discussion about housing and immigration with Sky News' Trevor Phillips?
On the present densities, you're going to add 3.4 million, or homes for 3.4 million people with your 1.5 million houses. On your own figures, we're also going to add to our population 2.5 million people over this same period. Are you content that more than 5 out of 7 new homes will go to immigrants?
Well, that's not the truth, and that's not the case.
That's what will happen.
Well, that's not the reality because where the
2.5 million immigrants that are in Rachel Reeves' budget figures going to turn up? Where are they going to live?
Well, there's plenty of housing in the UK, but the houses, especially social
hang on. You can't, on the one hand, say we've got to build this 1.5 million houses, and then say there's plenty of housing already.
There is plenty of housing, Trevor, already, but there's not enough for the people that desperately need it. So the homes, especially under our affordable homes programme, which is social and affordable housing, there will be there for people who desperately need them, local people. We've already outlined how we're going to support veterans and people who are fleeing domestic violence.
Okay.
Councils need homes for people that are on the waiting list. I've already announced changes to the right to buy, making sure they have
this doesn't quite make sense.
So that we can deliver the houses they desperately need.
Deputy Prime Minister, it doesn't quite make sense. You start the interview by telling me that there's a housing crisis. When I remind you that you have said yourselves as a government, we're going to need 2.5 million migrants. Some of them, by the way, people are going to build the houses. Suddenly, there's a lot of housing. Where are these people going to go?
Well, Trevor, first of all, when you say about building as well, the previous government did use migrant labour far too much instead of actually building skills here in the UK. I've announced £140 million for new construction hubs so that we can train people here to deliver those housing. So I don't accept that we're going to bring migrants in for that. We've always said that actually we need to skill our own people up. But equally, we need to build the homes that people need. Nobody's had a focus on social housing for a generation, and I'm going to build those homes because far too many people at the moment are waiting on council housing lists, and I've got to fix it.
You can imagine the foreheads of all of the Labour government's communications chief thudding onto the table as Angela Rayner says, who is the person in charge of what supposedly is a crisis in housing, saying there are plenty of houses.
It's just so bizarre.
And I don't want to overinterpret, but the fact that Matthew Pennycook was on the media round this morning, I think the government has decided he's the details man. They've sent Angela Rayner on this trip to Cambridgeshire with the Prime Minister, where the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, has given what's called a pooled clip. So he's given a clip about the housing crisis, and she's walked around pretty mute beside him.
But pity the Deputy Prime Minister, because it's not the first time this has happened, is it? Her plan for workers was taken off her and given to Jonathan Reynolds, the business secretary, to table. So
what do you think, Camilla, about this immigration issue? We've been talking about it before the podcast. I always find it quite uncomfortable when we talk about, well, won't immigrants take all these houses?
Yeah, but look at the figure. I agree with you. Look, I think we can have a discussion about immigration and its impact on both housing supply and the cost of housing in this country since 1997 without stigmatising immigrants. So the statistic is that in the lead up to Tony Blair taking power in 1997, cumulative net migration was 67,000. Subsequently, in the following 2 decades, 5.7 million people came into the UK. Clearly, housing stock has not kept pace because it was already struggling to recover from Margaret Thatcher having people buy their own council homes, and not enough council homes were built to replace those that then became privately owned. So on any one sort of basic metric, we need to be building not 200 or 300,000, I think 1.5 million over the course of this Parliament, including the time that's already tick-tocked away, gives us around 360,000 per year to be built. Conservative estimates suggest that actually it needs to be around the 550,000 mark. We need to be building a house every 5 minutes, night and day, just to keep pace
Sounds
with
absolutely ridiculous.
high immigration.
Yes.
So look, we cannot possibly look at the shortage and not relate it to the increase in population that we've witnessed in the last 2 decades.
I would just say to that if it wasn't for immigration into this country, particularly construction workers, we wouldn't have built even the number of houses we have built.
But we haven't built the infrastructure to keep pace with immigration, and not just housing, by the way, schools, hospitals, doctors and dental surgeries, which all need to be staffed by extra people if they have got more people to see in the local area. We are a quite dense country now in terms of population.
Not in terms of our brain powers.
Well, maybe we're a dense podcast in terms of our brain power. But I was just looking at how populated is the UK. We're 21st on the world scale of populated countries. That means that we have got 279 people per square kilometre, or if you like to deal in old money, that's 720 people for every square mile.
So we have in this country, exactly as you say, problems with space. If you look at France, they have, for a very similar population, about 38 million houses. We have about 30 million. But of course, France is double the size of the UK in terms of its geography. So you have space constraints, you have construction constraints in this country, i.e. we don't have enough workers, we don't have enough bricklayers, big day for bricklayers, there aren't enough of them. And we also have profitability constraints. If, as the government is demanding, many more of these new houses need to be what's described as affordable or in some way related to social housing, private housing companies will simply not build as many because the profitable margin on each house it builds is not as high. It wants to put capital in things that are very profitable. And so shareholders in the private housing companies that build most of the houses in the UK are simply not going to build as many as this government thinks they will. And there's already data showing that. If you look at the actual number of planning applications up to March 2024, they are down by 13%. The number of completions of new houses are down by 12%. So the market is going in the opposite direction to the way the government is saying it should be going.
In terms of sort of YIMBY versus NIMBY, because the planning process seems to be sclerotic at best and constantly hampered by different interventions from different directions. In my village, I live in a small village, quite a few houses have gone up. I've regarded them as fairly appropriate to the surrounding area. We haven't got some mass housing estate coming into where we live, which is on the border with the Chilterns, and it is, very countrified, and you certainly wouldn't want it to be concreted over in any given sense. But I appreciate the need for more housing to be built, because I wouldn't mind, actually, Kamal. I don't know if they'll be able to afford to, but my children, when they grow up and they have their own families, living somewhere in proximity to me and my husband in Hertfordshire. But, you talk about affordable housing, housing itself that isn't affordable, or social housing and is just plain housing, is still completely unaffordable. So some new properties went up. They're just terraced houses. I think they've managed to squeeze 3 bedrooms into 2 upper floors, postage stamp size garden. And my father actually said, oh, how much are they on the market for out of interest? And I said, oh, they're starting at 800 grand. And my dad went, like his head nearly exploded and went, what are you talking about? That is preposterous. I was speaking to somebody only last night, just giving a classic example of when he started out and started having a family. He bought a house in Fulham for 95 grand. That was probably about 25 years ago. He looked it up recently and it was on sale for 1.7 million. And he just expressed to me, with him and his 4 children, there would be no way on earth he could have afforded that property at that price at that time in his life. So we've seen this huge inflation. And, you know, this has been a problem for successive governments. It's particularly a problem for the Conservatives, because if you cannot turn around to the public and give them the aspiration, a realistic aspiration of owning your own home, what is the point of you?
Just like immigration, the Conservatives set targets for house building, which they never hit. We haven't built the number of houses that this Labour government envisages since the 1960s and 1970s, 300,000 and above a year. I'm a great fan of Yes in My Backyard because I live in a city. I don't think we should be sacrificing the beauty of our rural environments, particularly around the big cities in London. So, you know, people who live in the cities like me come out to the Chilterns to walk and to take the fresh air, and we know how that's good for physical health, for mental health, etc., all the reasons there. And I fear that from Whitehall, that's not going to be understood at a local level. In the cities where I live, what you have seen, and this is a great thing, is what are called fill-ins. So I live in North London. Nearby where I live is quite a large social housing estate, quite big, old-fashioned 1970s blocks of flats with big green spaces in between. They are now building, and I think it's Islington Council will be doing this. They are now building infill blocks. They're about half the size, but they're going to use that space to allow more people to live in London. I think the solution to this is higher density in the cities and the bigger towns, rather than what I find when you're out in the countryside is these slightly exec homes stuck on the side of villages.
Yes.
And that, for me, is where people will become irritated. And if Labour is talking about devolution and we want more power to local authorities and they can make their minds up, but on this issue, no, we're going to tell you what to do, I think that is a recipe for political controversy and possible disaster for Labour.
I mean, what do you think of this in theory? Because this does affect my patch, but a little bit further out. So are you familiar with the market town of Tring?
I know where it is, yes.
Indeed.
Not familiar,
Okay,
I wouldn't
so
say,
sort of
but
on
yes.
the Herts-Bucks border.
Yes.
And at the moment, the population of Tring, I think it has around 5,000 homes. The proposal in the Dacorum Borough Council local plan is to build 1,400 more homes in Tring. And as you say, sort of tag it on. I think they're describing it as a market town extension. And of course, the local residents are completely up in arms. I was just reading a story on the Bucks Herald, the good old local paper there. And residents are saying, you know, we are tearing our hair out and genuinely losing sleep over this. We're really, really stressed out, because to go from 5,000 to another, to go from 5,000 homes to 6,400, these homes are scheduled to be built between now and 2041. I mean, that completely changes the complexion of that area. Kevin Hollinrake, the Shadow Secretary of State for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, joins us now. Thank you very much indeed for your time, Mr. Hollinrake. I think it might be an obvious thing to say, and I don't want to channel my inner Keir Starmer here, but the Tories have failed on housing. Are you really in a position to comment on Labour's plans when you didn't deliver enough new homes when you were in power?
Well, we delivered on our target, which is 1 million homes in this parliament, and in the last parliament, sorry. And actually, the period between 2013 and 2023 saw record levels of new housing formations. So across that, an average across that 10-year period, record for the last 50 years, the highest number since the 1960s. So we made huge progress. We wanted to deliver more. And if you look where planning consents were when we left office, they were running at 300,000 a year, which is a significant increase from the 200,000 we saw when we took over. So lots of progress. Yes, we acknowledge we should build more in the future, but in terms of what we set out to deliver in the last Parliament, we delivered it.
Kevin, there were some shouts of shame when you were speaking in the Commons earlier today, when you linked the housing numbers that the government has said it wants to build with immigration. Just want to run us through what your argument was there.
Well, I just don't see how you can divorce the two. It's quite clear that new housing formations are calculated on the basis of population growth, and population growth is being driven to a certain extent by migration. So it really is just I was quite astounded that Labour members don't seem to think there's any kind of correlation.
Let's just listen to Matthew Pennycook's, he's the Minister of State for Housing for Labour. Let's just hear his response to you. And I'd love, Kevin, just to get your response to what he said.
On migration, Madam Deputy Speaker, he knows as well as I do that the majority of homes that developers sell in this country are to British nationals, that most parts of the country have local allocation rules in place and local residency requirements that means that non-British nationals can't access housing, that only those who are eligible for no recourse to public funds can do so. He knows those rules. He's scaremongering. It's beneath him. I know that the honourable gentleman doesn't really believe it, and look, the House believes it either, Madam Deputy Speaker.
How do you respond to that? He said it's beneath you, Kevin.
Well, it's totally wrong. What he's talking about, he's conflating. He's talking about rules around social housing, about the access to social housing. The point with migration is it doesn't just affect social housing. You get people coming to the UK, they're of all kinds of different income grades, income levels. So many people who come from away are wanting to either rent a house or buy a house, which can only be fulfilled by existing stock or by new delivery. So it's wrong to say that immigration doesn't have some impact on housing need and in terms of what proportion of the housing supply it occupies. It's not right saying they only occupy new homes. They put pressure on the wider housing shortage, further pressure. I'm not anti-immigration at all. Just you've got to make sure you are delivering the housing numbers to meet the need. If you are then not going to control migration, you're going to find that the housing need is greater. And that was my point. And what they've done since they took over is reverse some of the changes we made, which, for example, increased the salary threshold, which would reduce the numbers of people coming to the UK to fulfill our pledge to make sure it's the brightest and the best that come here, and that employers can't just jump for the easy solution, which is bringing people from away to fill job shortages. We need to get more of the people back into work who are out of work in the UK. That's what we need to do. So I'm astounded that Matthew doesn't understand the correlation, the link between housing formations from people coming from abroad and the pressures that puts on the housing market.
I appreciate that people from all different political persuasions can be NIMBYist, not in my backyard. But isn't it the case that some of the home counties where house prices are at their highest would be populated largely by Tory-leaning voters, and they're the ones who have been blocking developments in their area? There's an irony there in a way, isn't there? These are the people that would be warning against concreting over the green belt, as you have, talking about too much housing in the green and pleasant land. And yet actually that approach of saying, well, you can't build in my leafy home county's village has only really succeeded in pushing house prices up to such an extent that people can't have their own children and grandchildren living near them anymore.
I don't think that's what we're saying at all. I think we're saying everybody should take a fair share of the housing delivery. What you've seen through these new formulas, this new formula that Labour's brought forward, is a freezing or even a reduction in housing targets in urban areas and a massive increase in housing targets for rural areas. The House of Commons Library, which I'm sure you would accept as an arbiter of the truth, in terms of the numbers have just changed. We haven't seen the new numbers. That just happened today. So I haven't got the up-to-date numbers for you. But on the original proposal that Labour put forward, in major urban centres, housing targets rose across the board by 1%. In rural areas, predominantly rural areas, they increased by 100%. So a 100 times greater increase. Is that fair? Is it also fair to people in London who want to buy a house that Sadiq Khan's target has been reduced by 20%? Is that fair? I don't think it's fair. So it's making sure housing, everybody takes their fair share, and you make sure you plan the housing correctly so that it's spread as evenly as you can throughout the UK, whilst taking into account some of the other factors. But to me, this is a succession of changes that Labour have made. Family farm tax, scrapping the rural services delivery grant, which is about rural areas, and now sticking all the housing, or a lot of the housing, into rural areas. It really is a case of them wanting to start this war on rural England. It's a succession of different changes that are very unfair to rural communities.
Kevin Hollinrake, thanks so much for joining the Daily Tea.
My pleasure. Thank you.